Oh, well, thanks everybody for joining today. We appreciate the time. I'm Harvey Morrison. I am the Chief Revenue Officer here at CybeReady. CybeReady is an innovative security awareness training company, and we offer a platform designed to help organizations combat ransomware by leveraging machine learning and employee engagement to train employees to identify and not click on phishing emails, which, as you're going to hear, is the number one method by far hackers use to get ransomware into your organization. I'm joined by Dan Oroff this morning. Dan, I'll let you introduce yourself, but thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here.
Hi, Harvey, and thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I'm Dan Oroff. I'm the owner and founder of Oroff Law. It's a law firm which provides predominantly services around technology and data related aspects, a lot around data governance, compliance, regulation, data protection, cybersecurity, cyber regulations, AI, of course. I'm also the owner and founder of ClearPath, a consulting firm that provides DPO services and other consulting related services in that area. And also the owner and founder of the Strand Alliance, which is an alliance of firms and consulting firms that provide on global scale these types of services.
Hey, so again, we're really excited about having you here. I think that the topic we're going to discuss today is very relevant in today's environment. And what I thought I would do, again, just as the format of this, it's going to be a discussion really between Dan and I. I've got some questions for Dan that his area of expertise and focus, I think, can provide great insight for organizations. And then Dan's got, I think, some questions for me. So we'll kind of go back and forth on this. But if you have questions as we go through, or like for us to add additional thoughts or comments on things, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or send a chat in the meeting here, and we can stop to make sure we answer those questions. We'll also have a set of poll questions as we go through, so would welcome your participation and feedback in that. But Dan, if it's okay, what I thought I would do to get started and to kind of set the stage for the conversation today is just to kind of review, the current environment, at least at a high level, because ransomware continues to be, a major risk for organizations today. According to some recent reports, ransomware attacks increased by nearly 40% over the past year. So year over year, a 40% increase in ransomware attacks alone. And the effects are, pretty much evenly across organizations worldwide. From small businesses to government agencies to healthcare providers to critical infrastructure type companies, they really don't discriminate against who they attack. And the disturbing thing for me is not only are the number of attacks increasing, but right along with that, the number of successful attacks are increasing. And a byproduct of that we're seeing is ransomware payments are soaring. So the more successful these organizations become, the braver they become in what they're asking for. The average ransomware payment in 23, so we don't have numbers for this year yet, but in 23 exceeded $1 million for large enterprises. And then for small and medium businesses, while it wasn't that high, the impact on them was still very severe when they have to pay these ransomware demands. Overall, the global financial impact of ransomware attacks is predicted to exceed $30 billion by 2025. So to think about that, $30 billion. This makes it the most financially damaging form of cybercrime. And I think it really emphasizes the need for organizations to practice, proactive prevention and really focus on employee training. And I highlight training for organizations because one of the key stats that keeps coming out is 74% of ransomware attacks begin with a phishing email. There are multiple reports out there that give very similar numbers, the big one being the Verizon data breach report that came out this year. So, organizations, again, 74% of these attacks are started with a phishing email, right? And then once they get in, they're exploiting vulnerabilities in software, such as software that may not be patched or kept up to date, weak passwords, misconfigurations of servers, those types of things. So developing and maintaining, a strong risk management and mitigation plan, which Dan, I think you're going to talk about, coupled with, engaging and effective employee training, I think, and I think Dan, you'll agree, can go a long way in protecting an organization from ransomware. And then sort of the last thing that you start to see as a trend here is with this increase in attacks and the success of these attacks, we're beginning to see an increase in regulation applied to companies across the board around the world, right? Governments worldwide are really starting to introduce regulations that require incident reporting in certain amount of times, penalties for non-compliance, meaning that ransomware incidents now can have not only an operational effect on an organization, but a legal, a financial, and even a reputational effect on these organizations. So, let's kind of use that, Dan, as a foundation or a background. And maybe I'll pause here and sort of get your thoughts on, the comments there. And then maybe you can talk a little bit about, how you see ransomware, how are you defining ransomware, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Harvey. So yeah, it's all about setting the stage here. What are we talking about when we're talking about the risk? And I do agree that it's all about risk management. How do you prepare properly to these types of attacks? And when they happen in practice, what do you do? So these are probably the main two large questions. And when we talk about ransomware attacks specifically, I mean, the typical notion of these types of attacks is that it's a sort of a technique, some call it cryptoviral extortion, so to speak. The attacker is essentially encrypts the victim's files, making them inaccessible to the company or their organization, and demands a ransom payment to decrypt them. But that's not the only use case in ransomware attacks, because what we see is that in some occasions the attackers practically make copies and extract data from the companies or from the victims' systems, and then they threaten to publish or sell the data to a highest bidder in the darknet if the company does not pay the ransom. In some cases, I've already witnessed it a few times, it's a sort of a combined sort of attack, both encryption plus copying at least some of the data. And so it creates a sort of a enhanced risk in terms of the company. In most cases, you need or you're requested to pay the ransom in some form of cryptocurrency. That's the standard practice. And as you said, Harvey, the large majority, 3 out of 4 ransom attacks start with the phishing emails, with a sort of a Trojan that is disguised to a legitimate email. And the user is sort of tricked to either open an attachment or click a link. But there is the 25 other percent, and I think that the one specific high profile was the WannaCry worm that essentially drifted and traveled, so to speak, automatically between computers without user interaction. So I would say that, yeah, phishing emails is definitely the main trigger for these types of attacks, but it's not the only one. These attacks are usually conducted by groups of attackers rather than single attackers. They usually are more sophisticated in style. I would say that the most dominant attack group is called Ransom Hub. It's a sort of that they provide a sort of ransomware as a service type of services to others. And although ransomware is with us since around 1989, around 1980, for the past 34, 35 years, we do see an increase, as you suggested, Harvey, as you showed the numbers, and 2024 is poised to be probably the worst year in terms of the number of victims and the extent of damage that these types of attacks are causing.
Yeah, I think one thing I would mention there that we're tracking that really concerns me too, Dan, is the tie-up between these cyber criminal gangs and nation states now. So
Yeah.
nation states are starting to see North Korea, Iran, Russia are starting to see the monetary benefits of this and providing safe harbor to a lot of these criminal gangs, if not just outright collaborating with these criminal gangs and leveraging their technology to drive even larger ransomware types of attacks. So that's something we're tracking. It's very concerning for
Yeah.
us.
And it's, it's a big question, Harvey, and you're in the business of cybersecurity training. I mean, it's a sort of a puzzle. I mean, most companies today, or a lot of, at least a large percentage of the companies, do have some form of, personal training against phishing attacks, but there's still a high percentage of successful attacks, and it triggers the question why does it happen. Although, I mean, there is some form of, or some level of awareness of companies, but still we see more and more attacks coming and being successful in penetrating company systems.
Yeah, so I mean, I look at it and it is true that most companies do provide, some form of security awareness training for their employees, either because, hey, we're concerned, mostly we find because, hey, we have to be compliant with some other, government regulatory mandate. The other key fact, that we look at and we'd like to keep in mind around this is, even though the training occurs, right? And I think this gets to the fundamental problem, Dan, is 46% of employees, even though they're trained, are still struggling with identifying phishing emails. So think about that. Almost half of your employees are putting your organization at risk every day, even though you're training them. You can have the best firewall in the world, the best antivirus in the world, all those sorts of things. But if an employee slips and clicks on an email that they're not supposed to, you're putting your organization at risk. And I think employees are being targeted, right? Because they continue to fall for these attacks at a really high rate. And I think the reason, based upon our research, that this high rate of failure among employees, continues to go up is that training today is more focused, as I mentioned, on compliance, around checking a box. And it's not about actual learning, effectiveness, and engagement. And I think to see a change in these trends, right, where the number of, ransomware attacks start with a phishing email, I think the mindset of an organization really needs to change, and training needs to go from a, hey, I'm just doing it for compliance, to, hey, I really want my employees to learn, and really make them more effective at stopping these cyber attacks. Some of the issues we at CybeReady see with training programs today is, most training programs are focused on vast amounts of content. We've got 500 pieces of content that we're going to share, 800 courses that we're going to share. So they're more focused around that, and they're not really focused around learning. The training's not really tailored to an organization or a particular individual's role within that organization. Your training can't be a one size fits all. And with this approach, the current model of training approach, and I think everybody will kind of shake their head because they've seen this before, is, hey, I'm required to take a training class. And I have the training class pulled up, it's on my laptop, it's running in the background. And while it's in the background, I'm doing email or a myriad of other things besides engaging with this training and learning from this training. And there's even a study that just came out about 8 months ago from the US government around cybersecurity training. And it stated that employees are not really learning from training, one, and two, the majority of them actually dread training. And I think the results of this study are starting to show up in the number of organizations that we talked about early on, Dan, that are getting hacked. And the vast majority of them are getting hacked due to phishing emails. And it's because employees continue to fail to identify and not click on those.
Yeah, I may add maybe a couple of words from the regulatory perspective. So I would say that just about any type of cybersecurity laws, regulations, information security standards, they will all require personnel training, cybersecurity training. That's sort of a standards practice in these types of laws and regulations. But the large majority, at least the large majority of them, would not provide you with some details about how you need to do it and any details. But when they are interpreted, such as, for example, in the JP Morgan case,
That's a great one to emphasize. That is a really good one to emphasize.
It's the interpretation matter that matters. Essentially, when it is interpreted, you need to demonstrate that your training is effective, not just that you've actually only conducted the training. So that's definitely a point that you need to be minded to when you train your employees.
Yeah, we can share. I had a question about the study. We can share the study post the call here, and the first poll quiz kind of came up. But as folks review that, I'll maybe for those that don't know, Dan, I'll talk briefly about the JP Morgan case, where essentially one of their traders got in trouble, and JP Morgan said, "Hey, don't blame us. We trained you." And the employee kind of came back and said, "Yeah, hey, let me tell you, training." We log in and we say we're here, and then we go do something else. So you can't say that training was effective or that I learned anything other than you just offered it. So I think organizations are going to have to start addressing that if these ransomware numbers continue to go up.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, Harvey, I think that maybe that's a good point to talk about, or to sort of describe the type of risks and damages that we're facing when we're talking about ransomware attacks, because there are some risks and damages damage that could be caused specifically because of a ransomware attack, while others relate to cyber attacks in general, but we'll try to provide some or portray the sort of the sphere of risks and damage, because it could be, at least in some cases, it could be very severe. So we're talking about essentially about the immediate damage. That's I think that's the aspect that we need to maybe focus on at first. And immediate damage is the fact that if ransomware attackers are encrypting your data, then essentially you don't have access to data, you don't have access to systems. Potentially your services, production, operations are shutting down, and it could take some time until you can, get them back on track. And that's, I would say, the immediate damage that you need to face, and you need to be minded. You cannot provide your services, you cannot operate properly. So that's definitely one issue. The other is that if the ransomware attackers are copying samples or a great deal of data from your systems, and that's something that could take some time until you understand that this is what happened. Sometimes it could take days and even weeks until you get a full image on what exactly the attackers did in your systems. But if that is the sort of happening sort of attack that the attackers have undergone within your systems, then you do have to consider that the attackers could potentially publish the data. They could offer it to sell. That you start considering whether you need to pay or not to pay the ransom. These types of questions are, of course, wrapped at the very early stage of the attack. And so there's a sort of a growing risk that the leak of the data or the publication of the data would cause additional damage. Alongside it, there are, of course, regulatory risks involved. And first and foremost, about backups. Essentially, again, every type of regulation or law around cybersecurity, probably global wide, would require you to back up your data, but that's insufficient by itself, because we've already seen a great deal of ransomware attacks that in which the attackers could reach the backups as well and encrypted them, and that means that you're not able to restore the data from your backups. So the idea around, following these laws and complying with them is not just to make sure that you do have backups, but that but you ensure that you keep them away from the attacker's reach. That's highly important, and if you don't, you're potentially in violations, in law violations. That's one. Yep. One, of course, regulatory risk, and the other, of course, is around breach notifications. Yep. And there's a whole array of notifications that a company could be subject to. First and foremost, of course, data protection, around personal information. That would be the type of notifications that you need to take into consideration. Notifying the individuals that were victims, that their data was leaked, and to the local regulators. There is a duty, of course, in the U.S., in the EU, and in many other jurisdictions. This sort of triggers a great deal of sort of a project of its own, and large amount of expenses. The operational damage is not just about managing the notifications. It's about getting your systems restored, and sometimes the attackers cause a great deal of damage. And we can talk later on about the Change Health story from back in March this year, but we've just learned recently that the company has appointed a chief data restoration officer, and I assume that no one would want to be in a position that we need to appoint an officer just to manage the restoration of the systems and data. So these are the regulatory and operational damages. There are, of course, commercial damages. Your stock, if you're publicly traded, your market stock, your market price will probably likely plunge during at least for the first preliminary a few weeks following the attack. Your IP could be damaged. There are contracts with clients that could be damaged. Some clients would there could be some contract churns, and some prospects that would not agree to engage you under contracts as a result of that attack. We see it quite often following attacks in general, and ransom attack specifically. And of course, damage to reputation. There are some civil actions, potentially class actions in those jurisdictions, like the US and other jurisdictions where you can be subject to class actions, but that's not the only potential civil action that is possible in these cases. That could be, for example, if your systems are shutting down and you cannot provide your services for a period of time, then you're at least potentially in a breach of contract, and therefore you have some form of potential civil liability in that regard as well. And there's some personal liability as well. We learned it from the Uber and from the SolarWinds cases, where regulators and court point a finger to blame the CISOs for not managing properly the information security aspects of the company. And there's some personal liability under corporate and tort law that could be that can point out and found liable the managers and directors as well. So there's a whole array of risk that a company or an organization faces while being attacked, and that calls, of course, for a good risk management, a good management of this risk.
Yeah, no, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, I think there is a lot of work organizations need to do upfront, right? To get them, it's the question isn't, are you going to be attacked? The question is, when are you going to be attacked? And how prepared are you from a risk perspective to thwart that attack? And how prepared are you from a continuity perspective to get yourself back online as quickly as possible and not disrupt operations from an attack? That's how I think organizations should be thinking about it, because you're never going to go through the entire life cycle of your organization and not have somebody try to attack you. Before it was always there are two types of companies: those that have been hacked and know it, and those that have been hacked and don't know it, right? And so you've got to have those risk management plans in place now. You can't wait till you get hacked and do it, because you don't do a good job on it. And it costs way more to do it post-hack than it does preventing the hack. And I think the one other thing that I'll kind of echo off what you had talked about, Dan, there is, a lot of companies today, their value is tied up in that intellectual property that can be stolen from a computer. And a lot of times, or computer systems, and a lot of times organizations don't even realize they have been hacked until it's published on the dark web. And somebody calls them and says, "Hey, do you know, your intellectual property is spilled all over the dark web?" So, and then all of a sudden alarm bells go off and those sorts of things. So totally resonate with what you're saying there around making sure you're prepared, making sure you have and understand all the regulatory and risk compliance, and doing that before you get attacked, because you're going to be attacked. Is, I think, the bottom line from that perspective. So, one of the other things, I guess, since we've talked about being attacked and what's going on there, is maybe you could talk a little bit about, what are some of the initial steps organizations should take when they've realized they've been breached?
Yeah, I think the most, maybe the one important question is, should I pay the ransom if I cannot restore the data? And that's, of course, the sort of the big question mark of whether should I do it or not. And that's an interesting question, of course, because there's a sort of a friction, a sort of a conflict between a sort of a public policy approach of a state, of a country, and the individual interests of the victim, because from a public policy perspective, we don't want to pay these attackers, because it provides them some incentives to continue their attacks, etc. So what we see from regulators and law enforcement agencies is a sort of recommendation not to pay the ransom. But in fact, it's not banned. It's not banned in most jurisdictions that I'm familiar with. For example, in the U.S., it's not entirely banned, and of course there's current debate about it, whether it should be banned, and maybe a sort of a side additional question is whether we want to allow insurer companies to provide a sort of coverage to the ransom payments as part of the coverage, as part of the insurance coverage. That's part of standard practice today. That's part of the standard cybersecurity insurance policies that are provided and offered in the market, but it's under debate. But currently, it's not prohibited. So that's one of the issues that companies take into consideration. You do need to take into consideration, and again, that's that's definitely in the U.S., but I'm sure that it's relevant in other jurisdictions, that you might end up with paying ransom to certain individuals or residents of countries which are essentially blacklisted by your company, by your government. I'm sorry. So in the US, there are the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the Trading with Enemy Act that essentially formed a sort of a blacklist, what's called the SDN list, and therefore essentially you're not allowed to conduct any financial transactions with certain territories, with certain countries, with certain individuals, and you might find yourself while paying the ransom violating these laws, and they have some criminal implications as well. So this is definitely one factor to consider, and the other is that, well, again, in the US, but it's definitely the case in many other countries. Victims do tend to involve the law enforcement agencies. Over 50% in the US, over 50% of ransomware victims are approaching the cybersecurity task force of the FBI, and in the large majority, over 60, in those cases, over 60% of those cases of those companies that approach the FBI, they don't pay the ransom. So these are the current statistics in the US. So that's something that you need to take in mind while, evaluating the question, are we going to contact a law enforcement agency, the relevant law enforcement agency, in order to support us with handling this attack? That's entirely up to us. And are we going to pay the ransom? And I think that the bottom line is that paying the ransom would be the last resort, so to speak. I mean, the first thing that you want to do is to see if you can restore the data, and how fast are you going to restore the data. It's not just about the potential practical restoration. It's backing and getting your systems back as soon as possible is probably the main objective. And if you can restore data, but it will take you a month, for example, to do that, that will probably lead you to the option of maybe paying the ransom instead, and potentially maybe not facing any other type of damages, for example, civil action. For example, if the ransomware attacker would not publish the data, would not sell it in the dark web, there potentially would not be any harm to the individuals, and therefore there will likely not be a civil action as a result. So this is a sort of an assessment that you need to do. And that leads me to the sort of the more general image. You need to conduct, there's definitely, first things that you need to do from a technical and operational aspects. I'm not going to go into the, shutting down systems, cutting them from the internet, etc. But from a sort of a operational perspective, you need to know that you have a team, the right team, and you need to know that you're well prepared to conduct an assessment on the spot in real time in order to evaluate what exactly you need to do. Law enforcement agency, what are our opportunities, options in terms of fending off this type of attack? Do I need to report the attack? To which authorities I have to report it? What type of report I need to include, or what type of details do I need to include in any type of notification? Because there are different regulators. Each one of them have their own rules of when to report and what to include in the report, etc. You need to be prepared to do that type of assessment in real time. You need to know that you need to engage the relevant professionals, whether it be the incident response team that you probably need to engage in any case. But then again, you might consider engaging a ransomware negotiator, a professional that has specific expertise in negotiating with ransomware attackers. I know a few cases in which that I was involved in, and a number of companies that have paid ransom, but due to successful negotiations, they were able to reduce the required amount dramatically. So that's a sort of a successful ending to this type of attack. So it's a whole array of assessments that you need to do in real time. And of course, you need to be prepared for it because it's a crisis. It's a crisis, and you need to know how to handle it in real time while with the necessary preparation for it.
Those are all good points. I think, as we look at the time here, I want to make sure we can get to the end and be able to ask some questions. But one of the things I did want to try to highlight for the group here, because we've talked a lot about The risk, we've talked a lot about what you need to get prepared, but I think one of the things we should touch on is, what are some of the long-term strategies organizations can implement to stay resilient against evolving ransomware threats, right? And so, I try to think of many of the items that we discussed today are important. One of the things we talked about is training, right? Because again, that's the number one vector away organizations get in is through phishing emails. And one of the things that we're always talking with folks about is training can't be once a year, twice a year, once a quarter. It needs to be continuous in order to be effective. Ideally, training would be short, training would be impactful, training would be engaging, it would be delivered on a monthly basis. And we've delivered so it's, built around your organization, built around your role within the organization. And the other thing we talk a lot about too is continually updating training, meaning, hey, I clicked on a link and fell for this phishing email. Okay, great. Let's refine training and go back and make sure we cover that with you. Or, hey, I identified successfully this email. Great. Don't keep sending me the same thing. Let's continually update that training and continue to challenge the individual there to learn more, right? We see that drives engagement and it drives effectiveness of training. The other thing that we talked a lot about is keep your software stack up to date. Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, all these companies have enormous cyber groups that are always looking for, what's the latest vulnerability? Let's make sure our software is compliant and able to avert that vulnerability. So keep your software stack up to date. And then lastly, really cultivate, from our perspective, a culture of awareness, right? You need to make sure that cybersecurity, cyber hygiene, those sorts of things, those sorts of traits are in the DNA of your company. And again, I think this goes back to fundamentally the training program and how you're training your employees, and are your employees engaged, and is the training effective, and are they learning? So you may have some other long-term sort of strategies that you want to talk about for a minute here, Dan, and then I know we wanted to hop into some questions at the end, but those are some of the things that I like to think about and share with organizations as they think about how do we develop a very resilient organization from ransomware.
Yeah, absolutely, Harvey, and I do agree with you. Until now, during 2024, and we still have a couple of months until the end of the year, there are over 5,000 victims of ransomware attacks worldwide. There's 5,000 companies that were severely damaged by this specific type of attacks, and the number are gradually growing. So that's definitely an issue that we need to take into consideration. We are likely to be the next victim. That should be the assumption. That's one thing that we need to take in mind. The other, and I cannot overestimate the importance of awareness. Assuming that in the large majority of these attacks are caused by phishing emails. They could be, this is a type of attack that could be blocked if any of your employees are really aware of it. And I do agree with you, Harvey, that it's not just about ticking the box. It's not just about fulfilling sort of what the regulation X or regulation Y requires you in terms of general training that you need to provide your employees, but that's part of the culture of the organization that you need to be minded to, and building culture around cybersecurity in general, and around spotting phishing emails specifically. That's something that you can definitely do. It's a sort of a mixture of working with the right software, the right tool. On the one hand, that will provide a sort of gradual learning, and you can add some, from the awareness perspective, sort of think of, gamifying this issue, providing sort of trophies for those good employees that were not that spotted all the phishing emails and
Yeah,
maybe
really
provided.
take a positive reinforcement sort of approach to training, not a
Absolutely,
bad
yeah,
approach to training. I mean,
yeah,
that's one of
yeah.
the things we talk a lot about at CyberReady. If you know our founder really came out of the learning industry, not necessarily the cyber industry. So everything we start with, right, starts from a foundation of learning, which I think goes back to the point earlier that we talked about is, are you just trying to be compliant? Or are you trying to ensure that your organization becomes more resilient and your employees are ready, right? So it's more than just security awareness. It's really security readiness. So when that phishing email comes in, I can identify it and really protect the company. So I think we've got just a couple minutes here of time left, and I think this was a really good conversation. And you brought up a lot of great points that organizations need to think about. And maybe what we can do is maybe transition to see if the folks have questions. I know, Dan, there was one question for you that came up in the chat, and it was, has any organization been prosecuted before paying a ransom?
Not that I'm aware of um, to date, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't happen in the future.
This is a constantly changing environment, as we say.
Yeah, that's again a sort of a question mark because you don't, I mean, you don't have a real idea or understanding about the identity of the attacker. They of course they conceal the identity. So in order for prosecution to go ahead, that means that law enforcement agencies would be on top of the identity of the attackers that you paid the ransom to. And that's probably not that's not the usual case, probably. That's,
Yeah.
I mean, there are some successes by law enforcement agencies. I think that the FBI and other agencies were able to, not sure about shutting down, but sort of cripple the abilities of the Lockbit ransomware gang some time ago, a couple of years back. So they did have they were successful in identifying the sort of the identity of these group of attackers, but there are still a lot of attackers and groups of attackers that the identity is not known, and even if they're known, then they could be in some countries that you don't have access to. So it depends on the situation. I'm not aware of any sort of indictment or prosecution in that area so far, but again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't happen.
Yep. No, that's a great. Thank you for that answer. I know there were I answered on online. So yeah, we'll make all of this information available to everybody with the studies as well, so you can see the background information that we put into this. But I would like to thank everybody for joining the webinar today. Dan, especially you. I thought this was a great conversation,
Thank
and you
you.
brought up a lot of good points. I don't know, Jerome, if you want to put up the last slide there. So everybody can kind of see the contact information. Feel free to reach out. We're not seeing it yet. There we go. Yeah, so feel free to reach out and connect with us. But again, we enjoyed Dan, I enjoyed the discussion today. I really appreciate everybody joining. Hope you got a lot out of this, and feel free to reach out with questions, or if there's additional information in your own. We'll make the webinar recording available, and then all the follow-up content as well. So Dan, again, thanks very much, and everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.